بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب زدني علما.
So now the first thing, we'll try to understand the lab topology which we'll be using for the labs here. We'll be using the firewall. If you have done some firewall courses like the ASA or Cisco Firepower, I use the similar kind of topology. Now what we'll be doing is whenever you are connecting, you generally have to have the LAN. Okay. Now this is going to be the LAN which is connecting to my inside network where I assume the users are connected in the LAN. So I'm going to connect a router 1, which is going to simulate my LAN networks. And on the router 1, I'll be adding some loopback interfaces. So these are typically the loopback interfaces. The loopback are the logical interfaces which will be used for testing purposes. In the real scenarios, you can just assume that this is connecting to multiple branches away from where I'm getting the routes. You can assume or you can simulate that way. So that is something on the router 1. So I'll be using 192.168 1.subnet, which is going to connect to my firewall. The middle one is your Palo Alto firewall. And I'll be using 192.168 1.subnet. So mostly .1 I'll be using in the last portion, and I'll be using .10 on the firewall side. Now, likewise, I'll be using the same. Now, this part is going to simulate my internet. So I'm going to add one more router on the right side. Now the right side part is going to connect to my internet. So I'll be using some kind of public IP, let's say 100.0.20.subnet. In the real scenarios, this IP will be the public IP. Most likely it will be a public IP given by the provider. So we assume that way, and I'm going to use 100.0.20.subnet. Again, I'll use .10 on the firewall side, and I'll be using .2 on the router side. And again, on the router 2, I'll be using these loopback interfaces. Now, these interfaces will be my loopback interfaces, which I'll be using for testing purposes. So they will simulate my internet routes. Okay. So the loopbacks will simulate my internet routes. The router 2 is going to simulate my service provider, which is providing the access to the internet. Later on, when we do the testing, we'll try to simulate the traffic as if it is coming from the LAN. It goes to the firewall, and on the firewall we'll be configuring some access policies, and based on that it should be permitted or denied. So we'll try to see different rules or the different policies we'll try to implement. But again, we cannot directly jump into the policies just like you generally do in the production networks, because we need to understand the prerequisite lab setup. Even the same thing, when you are started working on the real networks, you need to understand your topology, you need to understand the connections, you need to understand the IP addressing. And that's what we'll try to do. So for the next 1 month, 1.5 months, whenever you are learning this Palo Alto course, probably we'll try to assume this is our production network, which we'll be working on, and where we'll be setting up everything from the basic. Okay. Now, that's what we'll do. So we'll be using this IP addressing scheme, the public IPs on the internet on the right side. So you need a LAN, you need a WAN, that is internet. Now the additional things you can also see, there is something called DMZ. Now demilitarized zone, this part. Now we call this as DMZ. DMZ3 I'm using because I'm using 2 DMZ zones. Now, if you remember, I already said DMZ is basically a place where you host your servers. Now, in the real networks, you generally host your web servers or FTP servers or email servers or any other servers you host. Like if someone on the internet want to access the website, so I have hosted that on my server here, and it will be accessing from this server, and it will you need to make sure that the user on the internet are accessing the servers again from the internet. And again, we are not going to place these servers here, because you can say, why should not I place the servers here? Because technically you don't want any user on the internet to enter into my LAN, which is typically a threat. So you don't want, you just wanted to keep your network separate, either in the form of a separate VLAN or separate subnet. Okay. So This is going to be my servers, and each and every IP is the loopback IP again on the router 3, and these will simulate my internal servers. And in the future, what we'll do is we'll write a policy to permit access to these servers, or we'll do NAT, where we are translating from private to the public IP. So all these things goes as we move on with the lab scenarios later on. Now, the same way, assuming that I also have one more network, one more DMZ, just to have a variation, I'm adding one more DMZ, the same thing. Maybe you can say this is like my data center, or some kind of data center where you host some important network. You have another DMZ where you also host the servers, and we can have a different policies as required. Okay, so most of the time we don't use another DMZ, but depending upon the scenarios, we might be doing up the setup. Okay, so on this side, the IP, I'm using 10.0.30.subnet, where I'll be using 30.10 here, 30.3 here. And here I'll be using 10.0.40.subnet with /24. Again, the basic rules. So there should be this different networks and all. So we got 4 different networks. 3 are must: the LAN and the WAN, or the internet, and the DMZ. Additionally, we have one more DMZ for additional verifications. Now, coming back to the one more part here, there is something called management network. So in my case, we'll also be adding this here. We'll also be adding this management network. Now, what is management? Now, this is my management VLAN. Now, mostly in the production networks, like in our case, let's say in my scenario, so we'll have a host, the PC, the host PC, or typically, if you know the basic management kind of thing, most of the management VLAN or the management network will host the management related information. Like if you have a syslog server, or if you have an NTP server, or you have some DNS servers or DHCP servers, or any other monitoring servers like SNMP. And here again, whatever the GUI access, the host which we use for GUI access, or Active Directory servers, it can be anything, or even you can place them in the DMZ as well. But typically, most of the services will keep it in a separate VLAN or a separate network from where we manage the services. And in our example, we might be using few of their services here. Now, here also we need one host or one computer, which is going to be used to access the graphical interface, because all the configurations on the firewall goes through the GUI, graphical interface, and we will be using one host and the browser to access that firewall. Okay, so to access that firewall, I have to connect from my computer to the graphical interface. So you need a PC. Now, of course, you can say, can I use a PC from here or here or here? You can still use it, but it's always recommended to have a separate management network, which is only going to manage the network. So I'll be using, either I can connect a different network. In my case, I'll be using 192.168.15.subnet, which is my local subnet I'll be using. So in my case, I'll be using this local subnet. If you go to my config, IP config, you can see this is my wireless adapter, my host, which I'll be using to connect. Okay, so I'm not using, now there are multiple options. Either you can install one VM. Again, I'll show you all these options, how to set up. But before we jump into the setup, we need to understand the requirement of that particular device and the setup. That makes easier, and that also makes more interesting to while you are doing, you can also understand why we are doing this. So basically, I can use a host, or I can, in my case, I'm not using the host. I can use a VM machine. I'll show you when we do the configurations, VMware host, or I can use my local host. So in my lab, I'll be using this local host. Okay, so this is my local host from where I'll log in. We'll get back to this. Okay, so this is going to be my complete topology setup, and mostly we'll be modifying this topology as needed as we move on. But as we go on, initially the interface IPs will configure, will do routings, will do NAT, will configure the policies. So majority of the labs will be based on this. But as we move on to some other options, like if I'm moving on with the VPNs, or if I move on with some other high availability kind of labs, there will be few changes in the topology as we move on. But majority of the lab, like 50 to 70%, will be based on this. And most likely it will be similar to the production network. Okay. So this is my quick overview on the topology and the IP addressing. So this is the common IP addressing which I use for most of my firewall labs. Even if you go through with any other firewall workbooks like FortiGate or Firepower, almost I'll be using the similar kind of IP addressing, similar kind of topology. The only thing changes is the actual firewall. So this firewall will change. It can be a different firewall depending upon the actual codes or the actual firewall will be setting up.